Timothy, you make some very interesting remarks at the start of this book about what you call the conspiracy of silence surrounding the Indigenous history of Australia, and particularly the conflict between white and Indigenous Australia in those early frontier eras. As a historian, what do you mean by that?
Well, the truth of what went on has been hidden from us, particularly in the 20th century. It's something which is quite mind-blowing when you finally go through the primary sources and discover that there's a whole range of violence that we just weren't aware of. Certainly when I went to school, none of this was obvious, and it was portrayed as being a peaceful settlement, and it was nothing of the sort. And when you look at the fact that Governor Bowen, the first governor of Queensland, and the executive who, when they were starting off in the 1860s after Queensland came into existence in December 1859, you find that they're actually orchestrating using the native police to get rid of any threat to white settlement.
But you talk about the primary sources there. I suppose so much of this comes down to sources. You make the point in the book that the sources are more complicated than just written documents, that we have to go and interrogate oral histories, for example, particularly amongst Indigenous Queenslanders, because those oral histories contain so much that's not reflected in the official documents. So when you talk about primary sources, what are you talking about? What's the boundary around that?
Well, it's ubiquitous in the newspaper coverage right throughout the 19th century, and also you're looking at original documents, for example, say original reminiscences of southwest Queensland by E.O. Hobkirk, which he wrote in 1865. You've got the recollections of Thomas Davis, who was the father of Steele Rudd. There are horrifying recollections. They're not all written about massacres and killings, but when they do write about it, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And also, when you're looking at oral history, it's not just black history that refers to massacres. I've found with oral history, both white and black oral history refers to massacres, possibly more obliquely with white people, but nevertheless, it's everywhere when you start looking for it.
So, Henry, you, as I said, you're a historian who's written on a range of areas that aren't necessarily to do with Indigenous Australia. Is this idea of the conspiracy of silence, is this something that pervades historical inquiry, or are we talking about something really specific to the national story on Indigenous Australia?
Oh, I think it's fairly specific. I mean, the interesting contrast is between the frankness with which the violence was discussed in the 19th century, and not just in books and letters to the newspaper, in editorials, and in speeches in the Parliament. I mean, it was openly discussed. The question wasn't whether violence was taking place out on the frontiers. It was whether it was morally justified and whether it was an essential accompaniment of settlement. So there was a frankness about it that is, I suppose, the most shocking thing that the researcher first comes across. This understanding, this appreciation of what was going on, gradually disappeared and during the 20th century, as the Australians wanted to write a history that put the nation in the best light. It was also at a time when it was assumed the Aborigines would die out, that they had no future in the Australian nation.
And therefore no voice in what history was going to be told.
So when I started teaching, I was given, because I was, teaching a course from the University of Queensland, and the book I was given was called Australia, A Social and Political History, and it was the most widely used text of the period. When I started teaching, I realised that there wasn't a single mention of the Aborigines. Or that's not quite true. There were two passing mentions, and they weren't even noted in the index. That is, by the 1950s, 1960s, they had virtually disappeared from the story. Now, if you took the Aborigines out, then you could say that Australia's history was uniquely peaceful, which many people did. In the sense Timothy's reflecting this, that this is the sort of history that he would have been taught, where both the Aborigines and the violence of settlement had virtually disappeared.
And yet it hadn't disappeared, as you say, from the 19th century discourse.
No, absolutely not.
And so what is it that's changed? What's behind that? Is it Is it an attempt to construct a national identity for the 20th century that's meant that we've felt this need to cleave off this aspect of our history, whereas in the 19th century we're more upfront about the violence because it didn't trouble us as much? I mean, what's going on here? What are the social currents that explain this?
Well, it's partly, to a considerable extent, it's the change in the world. I mean, the decolonisation of the world, the rise of Afro-Asian countries, the worldwide rejection of racism, all of these things are part of this. So too is the rehabilitation of indigenous people, tribal people in many parts of the world, and the great assertion in Australian politics of Aboriginal identity and Indigenous rights. Now, all of these things fed into history, and history is one of the last disciplines, in a sense, to come to terms with this. It had been done earlier by anthropology and by linguists, by artists, and history, in a way, was at the end of the procession.
Timothy, your book unearths some new details that we don't see in previous histories about the violence on the frontier, and Queensland is your focus, and I know you're based in Queensland, and so there might be an interest there, but you're also arguing that Queensland has a very specific, unique history that makes it different to other parts of Australia in this regard, and perhaps even more violent. What is it about Queensland that's so special?
Well, I think that the hiding of the truth about what was going on, even though, as Henry has mentioned, in the 19th century they were quite open. You can read the newspapers at the time and they're saying things like, we shouldn't be doing this, this is disgusting, and, we even had reports coming in from magazines printed overseas. There's the famous Blackwoods magazine from 1852, where they're saying things like, extermination then is the word, wholesale massacres of men, women and children. There's no doubt that the black population is being rapidly extirpated. These terrible razzias, plundering raids, occurring in the remote back settlements and pastures are for the most part ignored by the local authorities, Crown Land Commissioners, police magistrates and others, or else considered justifiable negricide. And when you've got those sorts of reports, they're being ignored by the authorities.
But did that not happen elsewhere? Was this only a Queensland story?
Well, you got much more of a response elsewhere, it seems to me. This went on for some 80-odd years of the authorities ignoring what was being complained about. And what is interesting is a lot of the people who are writing in to newspapers or writing to complain to the government about the way the native police troopers were behaving had in fact been involved in killing Aboriginal people on the frontier, and then had obviously got quite horrified by the extent of the violence and turned against it and started to object to this policy.
Well, that gives a sense of the scale of it. You've mentioned 80 years, so we've got a time scale. You're documenting here massacres, so that's not all of the violence. The groups that are smaller than, I think, 5 don't qualify within your scheme, and even then you can't claim to have captured every massacre and detailed it. But so all those caveats aside, how big are we talking about here, the phenomenon of violence?
I think we're looking at at least 50,000 Aboriginal men, women and children killed on the Queensland frontier. The big problem we have is we don't have the forensic evidence that one would expect today, because of the approach that the native police had, and also those squatters on the frontier who participated in this form of violence obviously did not go in to count the numbers and that sort of thing. But we do have on several occasions the mentioning of 100, 150, one instance a gathering of 400 that I can recall immediately, but then you're not told how many are actually killed. But then at the end of the report, it stated that none survived. Those who went there stayed there. It's all a tad oblique, and also the fact is that once you start getting up into far north Queensland, there's a much more blasé attitude, because the violence had been going on for so long that people were less inclined to be oblique about their references. So you even have a sense of humour being applied to fooling Aboriginal people about poisonings, for example.
Well, the poisonings, I was going to talk about that, because that was one of the things that really struck me. is just how casual some of it seemed to be. Some Aborigines would do some work, their payment was in food or tobacco or something which was poisoned, and then within a few hours they're writhing on the ground in pain about to die. And it's the way you tell it, at least, and I haven't seen the original documents on which you based it or heard the oral histories that it's based on, but the way you describe it, at least, it's as though it was a kind of sport.
Oh, indeed. Boy's own adventure. That's what one finds quite startling, is that the casualness with which this is referred. I mean, there's a classic example of when they were building the Cairns-Kuranda Railway. The fettlers were having to leave somebody in camp because the local bummer were getting in and stealing food supplies. And so what does the local writer in the Cairns Post say? Well, why not leave a bit of rough on rats, i.e. arsenic or strychnine, in the food? To us today, in the 21st century, it is truly astounding how blasé they were about the killing of other human beings.
It really strikes you as you read this book, I can tell you. The book that I'm talking about is Conspiracy of Silence, Queensland's Frontier Killing Times. Timothy Bottoms is the author. My guest in the drawing room, along with the Professor of History at the University of Tasmania, Henry Reynolds. Henry, what is it about frontier violence, you think, that leads to this kind of attitude, but then also the cover-up of it? Do we see it reflected in America's frontier, for example?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a fundamental difference with North America, and for that matter with Western Australia. In North America, the Indians were regarded as being the owners of the land. Now, that meant that a lot of the settlement was done by treaty and negotiation. And the greatest contrast is between Queensland and Canada. Now, they're both settled at much the same time. That is, Canada from the Great Lakes to the Rockies. They were settled by very similar people, very, British background, the same sort of constitutions, same sort of political and religious life. And yet the settlement of Western Canada took place with almost no killing at all. It was done by treaties and negotiations. They're called the numbered treaties, which went right across the prairie. At much the same time, settlement was taking place in Queensland, across the Great Savannah of North Australia, with massive killing. On the other hand, there's the contrast with Western Australia, which remained until 1890 under the control of the British government through the governor and imperial officials. There wasn't as much Aboriginal population in the north of Western Australia as there was in Queensland, but nonetheless, the settlers weren't allowed to have a native police force. What happened in Western Australia is that they actually went out when cattle were killed and they arrested people. Now, they brought them down in chains, but they arrested people, they took them down to the coast, they put them on trial, and they sentenced them to prison terms. And there were hundreds of Aborigines sentenced to jail. From 1859 onwards, it's the one part of Australia where massive settlement took place when power had passed to the colonists. And the colonists, and this is true of most empires, the colonists on the frontier are far less tender towards the indigenous people than the people in the centre of the empire.
I wonder, Timothy, one of the points you make towards the end of the book is that this does affect the way in which we can, as a nation, talk about and understand ourselves. There is something in the Australian inability to come to terms with this, the conspiracy of silence, I suppose, that kicked that off. Whereas other nations might have histories that are just as bad, perhaps even worse in some instances, but there is a more of an ability to confront it, talk about it, deal with it, and then move on. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, it's hard to explain why it is the case, although I've noticed that, first of all, we basically hid the convict era. Up until 1988 with the bicentenary, I noticed nobody would particularly acknowledge a convict ancestor. But with the 1988 celebrations, suddenly that's changed. Now, you'd never believe that people don't readily acknowledge an ancestor of that nature. And the same sort of thing with killing times on the frontier. I mean, that's how come we get rearguard actions from with the history wars and denials. The denialists who refuse to accept that this went on when the evidence is overwhelming.
But why? What's the point in denying it? This is what I'm trying to get to.
Well, I suppose it's a slur on the Australian national character, but I can't see why we can't acknowledge it, but I think that is a part of what is an aspect of Australiana which I think we have to start considering, and that is, why is it, for example, if you've got women in the armed forces who are being sidelined and criticised, the same sort of thing happens in the public service on occasions. People who are trying to bring something which is needs attention find that they become the scapegoats. It's shooting the messenger. This seems to be an Australian trait, that we're not taking on board the negative and seeing that we could turn it around and make a positive. That is what I think is something which we could learn from taking the truth on board in relation to our colonial history.
Okay, well then, final question to both of you. As historians, your work is really to try to uncover the past and present it as truthfully as you can. But leaving that aside and putting on a more of a social sciences hat, or even just the hat of a citizen, how would you like to see that history sound in contemporary Australia? What would it look like for us to take that on board? What would we do that's any different?
Well, one of the things that's happened in the last 10, 15, 20 years is the way in which we have made war as the absolute central experience. I mean, we are confronted by this weekly. There is now, of course, a massive injection of government money in this process, which will go on until 2018. Now, if indeed we are to continue to make war the fundamental national experience, then we have to deal with this war within Australia, which in my view is more important than almost all the wars we fought, except perhaps the Pacific War, in that it was fought in Australia and it was fought about Australia. I mean, I think we really do need to totally rethink the way we regard our history and the history of conflict.
Timothy, can you accept this history, confront this history, and yet still support a policy like the intervention? Does it make any difference in contemporary policy making?
Oh, I think it does. Certainly with the intervention, I think that they've... the one major point about all of this is the lack of consultation with Aboriginal people. And there are people that they can go and talk to, and what they've done is it's a top-down approach, and this is what I think is failing, is that there isn't enough consensual consultation with the very people who are going to be wearing the results of the control.
These debates are going to rage on. I think you're both courageous for wading into them, but then again, you are historians. This is precisely what you do. This is precisely your job. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. The book is called Conspiracy of Silence, Queensland's Frontier Killing Times. Timothy Bottoms is the author. It's published by Allen and Unwin. My guest in the drawing room, along with Henry Reynolds, Professor of History at the University of Tasmania. Gentlemen, thank you.
That's a pleasure.
Well, there you go. Check out some of my poetry. Warbles in the Wilderness series. There are 7 Aboriginal massacre stories there. Ciao.